Welcome to this video focusing on the composition index of risk. And the idea of composition index, which basically sort of provides us an opportunity to begin identifying proportional representation. And as you all are probably familiar now with the terminology of disproportionality, it reflects this idea of proportional representation or proportions in relation to a specific pattern, right? The particular pattern that we have great interest is in the idea of enrollment, that everything that is reflective of our system, that there should be a proportional representation of specifically racial, ethnic groups, gender groups, and so forth in relation to their overall enrollment, right? So if our overall enrollment is 20% Black, then in our different programming, there should be a level of proportional representation in a variety of programming, with whether it's special education, whether it's gifted programs, whether it's honors program. There should be a proportional representation, and that's predicated on the idea that all things being equal, that should be present. Now, the way in which we determine composition indexes, we're actually doing is we're comparing two risk indices to each other, right? As you probably saw in the previous video where you learned about the risk index formula, which is about taking the total number of a specific category, like for in this example that I have here, the total number of students with disability of a specific racial ethnic group, dividing that by the total number of the students in the same racial ethnic group and dividing it by 100. And we will always use that same type of formulaic approach to determining our risk index, right? And the composition index is really doing the comparison of two particular risk indices. So let me give you a quick example before I sort of walk through some actual data with you. So in this particular example, this is just to kind of render for you the idea of comparing the two risk indices to each other, right? So in the top box, you will see, or the top table, you will see the total composition index of a specific district, right? Where you have the total enrollment for each racial and ethnic group, which totals out to a total of 2,000 students, right? And then below that, you'll see the percentage that's reflective of that group. Now, the way in which we create that percentage is using the risk index formula, which is, as I showed you in the previous slide, in this example, it would be taking the total number, let's say, of Black students, which is 500, dividing that by the total number of students enrolled, which is 2,000, so dividing 500 by 2,000 times 100 gives us 25%, which means that Black students represent 25% of the total enrollment for that school district, right? And you'll see the rest of the numbers that are there for the other racial ethnic groups. And so that's one risk index that we want to do. And we want to compare that, right, to the next risk index, which in the table below, it's reflective of students with disabilities in the same district, right? So there you see the total, let's say, Black student enrollment of students with disabilities. There's 250 Black students that are identified with a disability, divided by the total number of students with disability, which is 590 times 100. So 250 divided by 590 times 100 gives us 42.37%, which means of the total number of students with disabilities, in this example, 42.37% are identified as Black students. And what we want to do in this is when we have those two risk indices, we want to compare the two. And we want to compare them because we want to understand how much proportional representation is existing, particularly in our students with disability enrollment. If, again, as I mentioned before, all things being equal, there should be a proportional representation of Black students in all sorts of categories, right? In this example of students with disabilities, there should be a proportional representation. But in fact, what we're actually seeing here in this example is what's classically determined or identified as overrepresentation, meaning Black students are 25% of the overall enrollment in the district, and they are 42% of students with disabilities. They reflect an overrepresentation, meaning that 42% is over the 25%. It's much higher than the 25%. Generally, we like to stay within 5 to 10 percentage points of the overall enrollment, right? And that doesn't mean that you have that's your cushion, right? But it's really, we want to stay as close to that proportional representation, right? So you can have, where you're, let's say you're 25% of the school district, and let's say you're about 8% from that 25%. It doesn't mean that it's nothing to worry about, but we should, in fact, we should probably take a closer look. But it may not be as paramount as, let's say, if there is a bigger range of difference like we have in this particularized example here. So taking that knowledge, let's go to some actual data here, right? So let's look at some specific examples. So as a quick reminder, as you all remember, how we calculate the risk index, as you see in the bottom row, which is reflective of a risk index of that row of students' disabilities, right? And the way in which we calculated that, if you all remember, 0 divided by 1272 times 100 gives us 0%, right? And then as you go across, the percentages that are at the bottom row are reflective of that total enrollment of students with disabilities by race, ethnicity. Now we have that. So we have that first percentage, right? Now we want to get to the next one, right? Which is the overall enrollment, right? And as you see up top, that's the total number of students that are enrolled by race, ethnicity. And we want to use the exact same calculation again, right? So we want to let's do Native American students as our example. So we'll do 18 divided by 7,036 times 100 gives us 0.25%, which means of the overall enrollment in this particular example, 0.25% of students identify as Native American students, right? Now, when we're all done with our calculation, now we'll have our percentage enrollment, which is reflective of our first row. And now we want to do what we did in that first example that I gave, which is we want to do the comparison. We want to look at, where are we seeing different types of differences of disproportionality, meaning over and under representation, and as well as where we're seeing proportional representation. So in this example, I'm going to just use some examples. I'm not going to use all of them, but I'll just talk through some of them, right? So let's look at our Asian Pacific Islander students. They are 9% of the total students with disabilities, and they are reflective of 16% of the overall school district enrollment. Here in this example, you'll see that Asian Pacific Islanders are underrepresented compared to their overall enrollment, right? But again, they're staying within that 5 to 10% band, right? So it's a bit of a concern, but not something that is monumental. Let's say if we see compared to other groups, perhaps. Same thing as we look at our Black students. They're 41.5% of the total students with disabilities, and they're 37% of the overall enrollment. Again, here we see the similar, there's not much of a difference there. There is a slight overrepresentation that we're seeing with our Black students specifically. Our Latinx students, they're 34.5% of students with disabilities and 32% of the overall enrollment. Again, there's the overrepresentation is not as severe as where we would consider that it's something for us to be closely needing to monitor. And lastly, our white students, there's 11.7% of the overall enrollment, and they're 11.7% of students with disabilities, and they are 12% of the overall enrollment. They are probably representing some of the closest proportional representation in all of the different groups that are represented here. The idea of composition, which I consider is one of the 3 sets of formulas that every district and school should really use as far as sort of looking at the texture and the dimensions of the disproportionality pattern, it provides us another avenue of really understanding what's the level of distance that kind of is existing in their patterns of disproportionality, especially when we start looking at various, granular sort of groupings by this, right? Where we should look at this not only by race, ethnicity, but look at this by race, ethnicity, and gender, where we can see sort of that proportional pattern as it exists with a variety of groups. I hope this has been useful for you. I consider this, again, composition index, just like risk index and relative risk ratio. They are paramount for helping us tell our disproportionality story. Good luck, and see you at the next video.